Hey everyone, it's Ben Hardy here, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about the all-new Ford Everest and how we might finally get one here in the US. Before we get into the video though, as always, if you're going to save time and money the next time you purchase a car, link to my car buying guide in the description down below. Let's jump right into it. So if you guys haven't heard of the Ford Everest, it is a body-on-frame SUV that shares a platform with the Ford Bronco and the Ford Ranger as well. So that means it has independent front suspension, a solid rear axle, and of course it has manly diesel powertrains powering it. Obviously the Ford Bronco doesn't have diesels, but the Ford Everest was developed for the Australian market, hence why it has diesel powertrains. It was developed by Ford Australia, Ford's branch over in Australia. Super creative with the names here. But it also has a turbocharged 2.3 liter four-cylinder. This paired to a 10-speed automatic transmission. You guys are probably pretty familiar with that because that's the powertrain that is in the current generation Ford Ranger that is sold over here in the US and as well over in Australia. Well, Australia actually already has the newest generation of the Ford Ranger because they get all these products a little bit earlier than us, but it's okay because for the most part, Australia gets a lot of products from a lot of manufacturers way later than anywhere else on the planet because, well, they're an island continent thing that is literally, well, not exactly in the middle of nowhere, but I mean, in terms of, Australia compared to North America, they are kind of in the middle of nowhere. But anyways, jumping back to the Ford Everest, it is a highly desirable vehicle because guess what? Everyone nowadays wants rugged, body-on-frame SUVs with solid rear axles and independent front suspension. The reason that setup is so desirable is because still having the solid rear axle means that the vehicle still has a pretty decent level of articulation. Obviously the front end, not nearly as much as the back end, but that is enough to be able to handle quite a bit of off-roading. And on top of that, because it has the independent front suspension, it gives the vehicle a really solid, nice ride quality. And it just gives the vehicle overall, again, being body on frame, just this like tank-like feel that people really want nowadays. Because guess what? There was this huge push for crossovers that have independent front and rear suspension that are unibody for the longest time, and everyone seemed to be going that route because you get a lot of ride comfort. But now people are realizing that that's not what they want because those vehicles just don't feel super, again, like tank-like. They don't feel super durable like, again, the body-on-frame SUVs and trucks. And so there has been talk of potentially bringing the Ford Everest to the US market because if you look at Toyota, they sell a crazy amount of 4Runners, and that vehicle is absolutely ancient. But guess what? It has all the right things. It has independent front suspension, a solid rear axle, and a very reliable powertrain that isn't necessarily the most powerful in terms of modern standards, but it is very reliable. And then on top of that, Ford is struggling to keep up with production demand on the new Bronco. Now, yes, part of that struggle with production would ultimately also affect the Ford Everest, but I don't think nearly as much because the Bronco is such a specialty vehicle, whereas the Ford Everest, yeah, it has quite a bit of modern tech with it. It has basically the same interior as the Ford Ranger, but again in SUV format instead of in truck format, and you guys can see that with the pictures in the video. But it doesn't have crazy stuff like the super specialized fender flares that are on the Bronco and the hardtop that has just been an absolute nightmare. And it doesn't come with 35-inch tall tires. Now, yes, you can get Broncos that don't have the Sasquatch package, that don't have 35-inch tall tires, but is it really a Bronco if it's not a Sasquatch, right? So anyways, the point that I'm trying to make is Ford could potentially fill the gap in terms of their production issues with the Bronco with this Ford Everest here for the US market. And on top of that, the Ford Everest isn't nearly as flashy as the Bronco, and a lot of people like that. And also, it's a real, like, solid SUV. And what I mean by that is you can't take off half of the vehicle, right? With the Bronco, you can take off the doors and the top. And so it's a pretty noisy vehicle when you compare it to most modern SUVs. Whereas when you go over to the Ford Everest, it's just like the 4Runner, where it's not a vehicle where you're going to be able to just easily take off the doors and the roof and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you with a saw, you can do anything. But the point that I'm trying to make here is there's a lot of people, obviously, that want a body-on-frame SUV that is just more normal, if that makes sense. It's less recreational, like the Bronco. Again, hence the fact that Toyota just completely sells out of the 4Runner every single year, even though that vehicle is just absolutely ancient. So everything makes sense so far. But that being said, there's quite a bit going against Ford bringing the Everest here to the US market. So first off, Ford already sells a vehicle in that size category, and that is the Ford Explorer, right? It's their unibody, third row, independent front and rear suspension SUV. It's a great family vehicle. And so Ford, is kind of thinking, oh, well, we already sell the Explorer here, so we don't need to add the Everest. But just go back to my comments on how people want body-on-frame SUVs with independent front suspension and a solid rear axle for off-road capability and on-road comfort, right? Again, go back to the 4Runner. So that's the first reason why Ford isn't really too apt to bring this over to the US. The next thing is, well, it's just hard to produce anything right now. And so trying to bring a completely new model to the US market when they're struggling to produce their current models definitely just makes things difficult. I mean, Ford already has canceled production on vehicles like the EcoSport to make it so that they can hopefully catch up on production with other vehicles like the Bronco. But there is another thing that's going in favor of the Ford Everest for the US market, and that's the fact that there have been talks of hybridization with the Ford Everest, which would make it even more appealing to people here in the US market, because everyone is all about hybrids because of crazy gas prices. And frankly, the off-road community is starting to really like the idea of a hybrid because of the extra range that you get off-road compared to a vehicle that is not a hybrid, and all the utility with powering different items because, again, it has a larger battery because, again, it is a hybrid. Now, Ford is probably going to go the Jeep route when it comes to the hybrid powertrain with the Everest and potentially with the Ranger and the Bronco, and not the Toyota route. And what I mean by this is the Toyota route of doing a hybrid is basically doing a very small engine, like a 4-cylinder, pairing it to a CVT transmission and making it so it is very economical but also very slow, right? Now that doesn't make sense for a truck-based SUV. And so the Jeep route is making it so that a vehicle does have solid fuel economy and solid fuel range, but pairing it to a regular torque converter automatic, hence with the Jeep Wrangler 4xe, it is paired to an 8-speed automatic, and giving the vehicle a ton of power so that it's not only fun to drive, but again, it's also economical. I just reviewed a Jeep Wrangler 4xe Sahara, which isn't a crazy off-road version of the Wrangler, it's more of like the on-road version of the Wrangler. But anyways, that vehicle showed on the trip computer that it was getting almost 30 miles per gallon, which is just amazing for any sort of truck or SUV, or truck-based SUV in this case, because we're talking about the Everest. And so there have been talks of Ford developing some sort of powertrain to do that. They're most likely going to use the turbocharged 2.3-liter 4-cylinder and add a hybrid component and basically make it so that it beats Jeep's 4xe in terms of power figures. So expect somewhere around 400 horsepower and then like 500 pound-feet of torque. And then obviously fuel economy close to 30 miles per gallon with this whole setup. So to bring everything together, Ford is considering bringing the Everest to the US market to have something to truly fight against the Toyota 4Runner. I know a lot of people will comment that the Bronco fights against the 4Runner, but the Bronco and the Jeep Wrangler are glorified toys. Don't get me wrong, I love both of them. I currently own a Jeep Wrangler. I love how it drives, but I have to admit that it's not nearly as daily drivable as something like a 4Runner. People kind of want to bridge the gap, and that's why so many people buy a 4Runner, because it has those rugged off-road looks, but it has so much daily driver comfort and convenience that you just don't quite get in a Wrangler or a Bronco. And on top of that, this segment of SUV, body and frame SUVs with independent front suspension, solid rear axles, just keeps growing. It seems like there's just so much demand for it, so it just makes sense. And then on top of that, Ford is in the process of adding a hybrid powertrain to these vehicles because Ford, just like other manufacturers, wants to have more electrification within their lineup. But obviously, they want something that is going to be desirable and competitive within the market. And so they are going to go the performance side of things, basically making it so that it is a hybrid powertrain that adds performance to whatever vehicle that it is being implemented in, but then also adds practicality in the form of full electric driving and better fuel economy overall. And so this is just my personal guess on the powertrain. Like I said earlier, I think it's going to be the turbocharged 2.3 liter 4-cylinder paired to a hybrid system. I don't think they're going to do the 2.7 V6 or the 3.0 V6 because, frankly, as cool as it would be to have those with a hybrid because they would have so much power, I just don't think it really makes sense right now. Again, like I said, I think it would be really cool, but the 2.3 liter 4-cylinder, frankly, is more reliable than both those powertrains anyway, so I think that it's kind of the route for Ford to go. But I'm guessing around, like I said, 400 horsepower, 500 pound-feet of torque with this powertrain. And then, you know, with Jeep's electric driving range in the 20s, it's probably going to have somewhere in the 30s in terms of its 30 miles, right, of full electric range, so that they beat Jeep on that figure. And then fuel economy, right, they're probably going to try to beat Jeep on that figure as well because, you know, Ford always wants to be first. Let me know what you guys think about this. Let me know if you would purchase a Ford Everest if it was in the US market. And I can tell you guys right now, well, I guess I shouldn't say too much, but if Ford doesn't bring the Everest into the US market in the next few years, then I'm probably going to be owning a Toyota in the very near future. That's all I'm going to say. That's going to sum things up. I'll see ya.